Hi, this is Brock Dickinson. I'm coming to you today from the city of St. Catharines in Canada. This week I had the opportunity to meet with and speak to the Ontario Federation of Agriculture as they were wrestling with the question of how to actually reduce interprovincial trade barriers. So since the advent of President Trump's tariff war, this has been looming large in the attention of Canadians. That for generations we have been talking about the fact that we have these crazy interprovincial trade barriers, things that make it more difficult to trade between provinces than to trade between countries sometimes. And that if we're faced with the loss of American markets, we need to get on top of this and we need to eliminate or resolve those interprovincial trade barriers as quickly as we can. This is all happening again in that context of chaos. We've just come through Liberation Day, which was supposed to sort of tell the world what was going on in President Trump's mind with the tariffs approach. And in fact, although he threw out lots of numbers and gave us some fancy charts, badmouthed Canada a little bit in the process, there was very little information about what any of this meant in the Canadian context. And it means that there's no escape from the pressure. We really need to be seriously thinking about things like the elimination of interprovincial trade barriers. But what does it mean to actually start to do that instead of just thinking of that as a fancy phrase that we use? Well, part of this is kind of exploring the implications of what happens with our supply chains. In the automotive sector, we think about the typical gas-powered car that's built jointly between Canada and the United States. That automobile has 30,000 components. And so the supply chain that runs back and forth across the border and extends out into other countries as well means that when we run into this chaos, there's real challenges in terms of understanding that supply chain. But if you imagine for a moment that you can't get a car part for 3 months, or that you've got 3 months of uncertainty, in the automotive sector, that delays your time to sale, time to market. It sort of postpones the eventual sale, but it doesn't undermine all of your business model immediately. Now think about the agricultural sector. If I say we can't figure out what this tariff means, or you can't get access to this part of your supply chain, into these seeds or those inputs like pesticides or fertilizers, it's not just a delay in my business model. It can mean the death of my business. If I miss a planting season, if I fail to be able to harvest at the appropriate time, if my market disappears completely and my crop rots before I can sort of find a buyer, this uncertainty plays out much larger in the context of the agricultural sector than it does for others. And so that needs to be kind of priority number one as we think about how interprovincial trade barriers could be managed to benefit the agricultural sector. We're trying to overcome some degree of the uncertainty and provide a certain level of stability for producers in the agricultural space. And I think there's 3 ways that we can start to do that almost immediately. The first is recognizing that we need speed in this process, but not haste. What do I mean by that? Well, remember the old expression that haste makes waste? Speed suggests that we're going to move resolutely and forcefully forward. Haste may imply that we're kind of running and scrambling in all directions, and that we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater a little bit, and some of the implications of what we're doing might not make the most sense. I do worry about this a little bit because reducing interprovincial trade barriers has become a sort of a key political talking point. Just before the government of Prime Minister Carney resigned, he appointed his new cabinet. Chrystia Freeland, former Deputy Prime Minister, was the minister responsible for interprovincial trade negotiations. That means the intent was to put some really high-powered cabinet folks behind this issue and move quickly and aggressively. Now, I don't know who's going to win the election. I'm not here to predict that in particular, but regardless of who becomes the next Prime Minister of Canada, there is a sense that this will be a priority issue, and there will be weight and power put behind the question of interprovincial trade barriers. And the danger in doing that is that we may rush a lot of stuff through before we fully understand the implications of what's happening. And part of that relates to the sheer volume of things that we need to do. Estimates as to the number of interprovincial trade barriers vary pretty widely, with the numbers ranging from 200,000 to 400,000 interprovincial barriers. Tackling those one at a time is impossible, but waving a magic wand and eliminating all of them could also produce some really substantial challenges and problems. I think, for example, of the way in which this might play out in the context of specific industries. Two particular crops that we seem to have seen some surplus of, given the trade constraints, include potatoes and cucumbers. As the ability to kind of ship those south has dried up a little bit, suddenly producers are looking for markets here at home in Canada, and we're kind of overwhelmed with the number of potatoes and cucumbers that we have, which is crashing the prices. That's an example of what happens when we move quickly. In that case, forced by the tariffs from President Trump. But if we eliminate a bunch of barriers to sort of make trade free between the provinces, we want to also make sure we're not just creating a dumping ground for the extras that one province has versus another, and that we lower the price of the commodity so much that it eliminates the market opportunities. The flip side of this is also true. I have heard from well-placed sources in the food industry that it's very difficult to find non-US sources of baby spinach at the moment. So there's an opportunity that farmers can move to, but we've got to ensure that the system allows them to move in that direction with some sense of certainty. And so as we change these regulations, we want to do it in a relatively careful and measured way. And I think the Canadian Federation of Independent Business has come up with a really interesting model of how we might do this. So rather than saying we're going to change the 400,000 regulations governing international or interprovincial trade across the country, we're going to sort of take a more pragmatic approach. If we can't rewrite 400,000 regulations and we can't just wave a magic wand and say they're all gone, can we do something that sort of represents a bit of an intermediate step? And their suggestion has been to do things like recognize each other's standards. So the province of Nova Scotia can recognize the standard of the province of Alberta, or the province of British Columbia can recognize the standard of the province of Quebec. It doesn't require each of those provinces to change their own regulations, merely to recognize that the regulations of the other province are equally valid and therefore level the playing field over the longer term. And that mutual recognition of standards and approaches and processes will allow us to start to dismantle the interprovincial trade barrier system without kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater in many instances. The second piece of the puzzle that I think we need to spend some time thinking about is how we encourage industry itself to build relationships across interprovincial trade barriers. So we've been reasonably good over the last few months at building connections and communications between Canadian agricultural producers and American agricultural producers. And so, for example, leading up to Liberation Day and some of these trade war discussions, potato farmers and their organizations in the United States have been very supportive of Canadian potato farmers, suggesting that the tariffs proposed do not make sense and that the industry is so fully integrated that they need to be able to collaborate and cooperate together moving forward. Not so much with the onion farmers. They've been pro-tariff. That's a bit of a different story, targeting primarily on their counterparts in Mexico. But that example of potato communication suggests that there is an opportunity for industry advocates to work together. On the day before Liberation Day, the National Pork Producers Council in the United States came out saying that tariffs make no sense in the pork context either, that this is really a binational industry. So if it works in that international context, it should also work in the interprovincial context. And so how do we kind of move forward to make sure that farming organizations or commodity groups in places like Nova Scotia or Prince Edward Island are connected with their counterparts in Manitoba and Saskatchewan? That way, when it comes time to talk about the elimination of interprovincial trade barriers, there are pre-existing relationships, and you can build mutual support and mutual respect as a means for recognizing each other's standards and approaches to these things and evening out that process of reducing the trade barriers. That's not an easy process. These are people who are used to seeing each other in some instances as competitors. But by building those direct business-to-business, association-to-association relationships, there may be an opportunity to more collaboratively find ways to address the interprovincial trade barrier issue. And the third and final thing that I'd suggest in this context is that we look for pilot projects. We look for places that we can start small and apply the lessons gradually over broader and broader geographies. And I think the classic example of how this could work comes in the field of meat inspection. Every province has a different sort of set of regulations around the inspection of meat. And the federal government has a layer of regulations and rules above that that sort of interfere and interact and engage with all of these different jurisdictions at the same time. And so the meat space is a very difficult one to navigate, and the trade barriers are particularly entrenched. I think, though, that there are interesting examples of how we can make progress in this space. And the best of those comes from the city of Lloydminster. So Lloydminster is a community that actually straddles the Alberta-Saskatchewan border. A portion of the community sits on each side of that border, and historically that created real challenges for livestock farmers, for meat producers, and even for sandwich makers in the community. That it was very difficult to take any meat-related product from one part of the community and sell it or move it through the other part of the community. And eventually what happened was that the provincial governments and the federal government got together and carved out sort of a safe space for Lloydminster. That the rules that apply elsewhere in Alberta and Saskatchewan and elsewhere in Canada don't necessarily apply in the same way in Lloydminster, that they've created a zone in which there is an elimination of interprovincial trade barriers already. That represents to me a kind of a case study or a pilot project where we can say, here's what happened when we did that. Here's what the implications were and the impacts were on the community, and this is what we learned from that process. And having gone through that pilot phase, we can now take the lessons learned and extend them more broadly across the entire country. And in that way, we'll be able to sort of test these ideas out at a local level first, create positive local impacts, and ideally find a blueprint that allows us to take those ideas to the national level. So those are three things that we can start to do on the interprovincial trade barrier front for the agricultural space. I think, though, that there's a certain degree to which these barriers are just inherent to the prospect of being Canadian. What's the largest provincial trade barrier that we would have? It's probably distance, right? To think about the east-west distance that we have to ship goods or products in order to make interprovincial trade work, it's far more costly than the north-south routes that we've traditionally taken advantage of in our economy. So the hope is, in the long run, that we will be able to reopen those north-south routes, that common sense will eventually prevail south of the border, and that Canadian agricultural producers, amongst other industries, will be able to start to think about reopening those markets. But in the meantime, we may have to suck it up a little on the Canadian side of the border and say, we've got increased costs, we've got increased challenges, but if we can start to take some concrete measures in respect to these specific barriers in specific industries, we may be able to make some real progress. And even the most conservative estimates suggest that if we do that, we could grow the Canadian economy by as much as 7%.